"You need to move to the back where you belong," the platinum blonde man sneered, pointing toward economy class like he was directing traffic. "This seat is for people who actually matter." What he didn't know was that the quiet black man in the hoodie sitting in 1A wasn't just any passenger. He was the lawyer who held the legal contracts for the entire airline fleet. And in exactly 7 minutes, one phone call would ground every plane in the terminal and destroy a billionaire family's empire forever. The alarm in Damon, Washington's Chicago penthouse whispered to life at 4:30 a.m. But he was already awake, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The city sprawled beneath him in pre-dawn darkness, its lights reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds on black velvet. At 38, Damon had learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the world demanded his attention, before clients called seeking justice and opposing counsel tried to outmaneuver him in courtrooms that had once seemed impossible for someone who looked like him to enter. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had mastered the art of understated power. Tall and lean with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and hands that had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions. This morning, those hands held a cup of Ethiopian coffee, the steam rising between him and his reflection as he reviewed the mental checklist for the day ahead. London. The maritime arbitration case. $500 million hanging in the balance, and 3 years of preparation about to culminate in what would likely be the defining case of his career. Excellence is your armor, but dignity is your weapon. His mother's voice echoed in his mind the same words she'd spoken when he'd come home crying from school at age 7 because a teacher had assumed he couldn't read advanced books. The same words she'd repeated when security guards followed him through department stores as a teenager, when law school classmates questioned whether he deserved his spot, when senior partners at his first firm treated him like an affirmative action hire rather than the Harvard Law Review editor who'd graduated summa cum laude. Damon moved through his morning routine with the precision of someone who understood that every detail mattered. He selected his travel outfit carefully. A charcoal cashmere hoodie that cost more than most people's monthly salary, but looked deceptively simple, paired with dark premium denim and white leather sneakers that had been handcrafted in Italy. The only hint of his success was the Patek Philippe Nautilus on his wrist, but he'd learned to slide that under his sleeve when he wanted to observe rather than command attention. The hoodie was strategic. In his experience, people revealed their true character when they thought they were dealing with someone powerless, someone they could dismiss or intimidate. The hoodie made him invisible in spaces where suits commanded immediate respect, allowing him to see who people really were when they thought no one important was watching. It was a test he'd been running for years, and the results had shaped his understanding of human nature in ways that made him a more effective attorney and a more strategic thinker. His driver arrived precisely at 6, a punctuality that Damon both expected and appreciated. Marcus, a former Marine who'd been driving for Damon for 3 years, understood the rhythm of his employer's life, the way important calls could come at any moment and change the trajectory of entire days. As they navigated the early morning traffic toward O'Hare, Damon reviewed the maritime case files one final time, his mind working through the complex international shipping law that would determine whether his client, a small family-owned shipping company, would survive or be crushed by a multinational corporation's aggressive legal strategy. This case going to change things for a lot of people, Marcus observed, catching Damon's eye in the rearview mirror. It wasn't really a question. Marcus had been present for enough phone calls, had driven to enough late-night strategy sessions to understand that Damon's cases were rarely just about money. They were about power, about who got to make the rules and who had to live by them. Damon nodded, thinking about the 47 families whose livelihoods depended on the small shipping company his client owned, the communities that would be affected if the multinational corporation succeeded in its predatory lawsuit. Everything's connected, Marcus. A decision made in a London courtroom affects dock workers and Baltimore truck drivers in Ohio, families who've been in the shipping business for generations. That's why we do the work. The conversation reminded Damon of his mentor, Judge Patricia Williams, who'd passed away 6 months earlier after a long battle with cancer. She'd been the one to teach him that the law wasn't just about winning cases, it was about using the system to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Her voice had been the one to guide him through the transition from being an attorney who happened to be black to being a black attorney who used his position strategically to create change that rippled far beyond individual cases. As they approached the airport, Damon's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. British Airways had a mechanical issue. Switched you to Skyline Airways. Same departure time, seat 1. A confirmed. He smiled slightly, knowing that Linda had probably pulled strings to ensure he got the premium seat. What she didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that his law firm held the compliance contracts for Skyline Airways' entire domestic fleet. It was information he kept confidential, part of a larger strategy of maintaining leverage, while appearing to be just another passenger navigating the complexities of commercial aviation. O'Hare Terminal 3 hummed with the familiar energy of early morning travelers, the mixture of excitement, exhaustion, and anxiety that characterized airports worldwide. Damon moved through the space with the easy confidence of someone who'd navigated countless terminals, but his trained eye cataloged the subtle hierarchies that played out around him. The way gate agents straightened slightly when well-dressed passengers approached. The deference shown to first-class travelers. The unspoken codes of dress behavior and entitlement that determined how people were treated in spaces like this. At the Skyline Airways first-class check-in counter, he encountered Elena Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran gate agent whose professional smile brightened into something more genuine when she processed his boarding pass. "Mr. Washington, welcome aboard. I see you're traveling to London today. Business or pleasure?" It was the kind of question that flight staff asked automatically, but Elena's tone suggested genuine interest rather than scripted pleasantry. "Business?" Damon replied, offering his own smile. "International arbitration case. Hopefully the last trip I'll need to make for this particular client." He paused, studying Elena's name tag and the small pin beside it indicating 15 years of service. "Congratulations on your anniversary with the airline. 15 years is impressive in any industry, but especially in aviation." Elena's surprise at being noticed at having her service acknowledged by a first-class passenger was evident in her widening smile. "Thank you, Mr. Washington. Most passengers don't notice the pins. It's been a good 15 years, though the industry has changed a lot since I started. People are more stressed now, more demanding. Sometimes I think we've forgotten that travel used to be something special, something people dressed up for and treated with respect." The conversation was brief but illuminating, giving Damon insight into the pressures that frontline airline employees faced the way they were caught between corporate policies and customer demands. It was information that might prove useful, but more importantly, it was a reminder that behind every system were human beings trying to do their jobs with dignity and professionalism, despite circumstances beyond their control. As he made his way toward the gate, Damon reflected on Skyline Airways' recent history and his firm's complex relationship with the airline. Washington and Associates had been retained 2 years earlier when Skyline faced a series of discrimination lawsuits from passengers and employees. The legal work had been extensive, reviewing policies, training programs, and complaint procedures to ensure compliance with federal civil rights laws. More significantly, his firm held the legal review contracts for the airline's leasing agreements, a relationship that gave him considerable behind-the-scenes influence over the company's operations. The gate area was filling with passengers for the London flight, a mixture of business travelers and tourists that represented the international nature of the route. Damon found a quiet corner where he could review his case files while observing the pre-boarding dynamics. He watched flight attendants conducting their pre-flight briefings, noting the professionalism of the lead flight attendant Patricia Miller, whose 22 years of experience showed in the way she coordinated her team's preparations. Captain Jennifer Walsh emerged from the jet bridge conducting a final walk-around inspection, with the focused intensity of a pilot who'd logged over 15,000 flight hours without a single incident. Her reputation in the industry was impeccable, known for her calm handling of difficult situations and her advocacy for crew safety protocols. Damon had worked with her testimony in a previous case involving pilot fatigue regulations, and he respected her commitment to both safety and fairness in an industry where both were sometimes compromised by economic pressures. The boarding announcement crackled over the gate speakers, and Damon gathered his materials with the efficiency of someone who'd traveled this route many times. His carry-on contained everything he needed for the London arbitration, carefully organized files that represented 3 years of investigation, negotiation, and strategic planning. As he joined the first-class boarding line, he noticed the subtle dynamics of privilege and hierarchy that played out even in this small space, the way Platinum status members positioned themselves, the deference shown by gate agents to certain passengers based on their apparent status or demeanor. Boarding the aircraft, Damon settled into seat 1A with the satisfaction of someone who appreciated both comfort and strategic positioning. The window seat gave him a view of the tarmac operations, but more importantly, it was far enough from the galley and lavatories to provide the quiet he needed for final case preparation. He arranged his materials on the console, opened his maritime law brief to the section covering international shipping insurance disputes, and allowed himself to focus on the intellectual challenge ahead rather than the minor dramas of commercial aviation that surrounded him. The commotion at Gate B12 began before Blake Sterling Hartwell even reached the check-in counter, his voice carrying across the terminal with the particular authority of someone who'd never been told no by anyone whose opinion mattered to him. At 26, Blake possessed the kind of confidence that came from inheriting power rather than earning it. Platinum blonde hair styled in a way that cost more than most people's weekly salary, wearing a Tom Ford suit that fit his lean frame perfectly, but somehow managed to look like an expensive costume rather than natural authority. "This is unacceptable," he announced to Elena Rodriguez, who had the misfortune of being the gate agent when Blake discovered that his usual seat 1A was occupied. "I specifically requested seat 1A. I always sit in 1A. My assistant called yesterday to confirm it." His tone carried the frustrated edge of someone accustomed to having problems solved instantly by invoking his family name, a strategy that had worked consistently throughout his privileged life, but was encountering unexpected resistance this morning. Elena checked her computer screen with the patient professionalism of someone who'd dealt with demanding passengers for 15 years. "Mr. Sterling Hartwell, I see that you requested seat 1A, but it was already confirmed for another passenger when your reservation was made. I have you confirmed in seat 2B, which is also a window seat in first class, or I can check if there are any other premium locations available." Blake's face flushed with indignation, the color rising from his collar to his hairline in a way that suggested he wasn't accustomed to having his requests treated as anything less than commands. His background was written in every gesture, every assumption about how the world should respond to his presence. The Sterling Hartwell development empire had shaped Chicago's skyline for 3 generations, owning everything from luxury hotels to commercial high-rises with political connections that reached from City Hall to the governor's mansion. Blake had grown up understanding that his family name opened doors, solved problems, and ensured that inconveniences like airline seating were handled by someone else. "You don't understand," Blake said, his voice taking on the edge that Elena had heard before from passengers who believed their problems were more important than anyone else's. "I have a crucial meeting in London. I need the workspace that 1A provides. The lighting is better there, the angle is better for my laptop. I've been flying this route monthly for 2 years, and I've always had that seat. Someone made a mistake, and I need you to fix it." What Blake didn't mention, what he'd learned not to advertise too openly, was that his crucial meetings in London were primarily social events, opportunities to network with other wealthy young men whose primary qualification for international business was their family connections. His role as Vice President of International Development at Sterling Hartwell was largely ceremonial, a title that gave him access to corporate accounts and travel budgets while requiring little actual responsibility or accountability. Elena's computer showed that passenger Damon Washington had checked in 2 hours earlier, confirming Seat 1A with the punctuality and advanced planning that characterized serious business travelers. She could also see from the reservation notes that Mr. Washington was flying to London for legal proceedings, which suggested the kind of time-sensitive business that made seat changes particularly problematic. "Sir, I understand your preference, but the passenger in 1A checked in very early this morning. These requests really need to be made at the time of booking to guarantee specific seat assignments." Blake's frustration escalated to anger as he realized that invoking his family name wasn't immediately solving the problem. "Do you know who my father is?" he asked the question that had opened doors throughout his life but was falling flat with Elena's professional resistance. "Richard Sterling Hartwell owns half the commercial real estate in downtown Chicago. My family has a corporate account with this airline that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. I'm not asking for charity here. I'm asking for basic customer service for a platinum member whose family keeps your company profitable." The threat was implicit but clear. Fix this problem or face consequences that would extend far beyond Elena's authority to handle. It was a strategy that Blake had learned from watching his father navigate business challenges, the understanding that leverage could be applied at any level of an organization to achieve desired outcomes. What he failed to understand was that some problems couldn't be solved by intimidation, and some employees had encountered enough entitled passengers to develop immunity to threats that came with expensive suits and famous family names. Patricia Miller, the lead flight attendant, approached the gate counter after overhearing the escalating conversation. Her 22 years with Skyline Airways had exposed her to every type of passenger from grateful families taking their first international trip to billionaires who treated aircraft like private jets. She'd learned to read the signs of trouble before they became major disruptions, and Blake Sterling Hartwell was displaying every red flag that suggested a difficult flight ahead. "Is there something I can help with?" Patricia asked, her tone professional but firm. She could see Elena's stress level rising, could sense that this was developing into the kind of passenger conflict that could delay departure and create problems for everyone aboard the aircraft. Her instinct was to find a diplomatic solution that satisfied Blake's ego while maintaining the integrity of confirmed seat assignments. But she could already sense that this particular passenger might not be interested in reasonable compromises. Blake turned his attention to Patricia with the relief of someone who believed he was finally speaking to someone with real authority. Finally, someone who understands customer service. "I need to speak to whoever can fix this seating situation. I'm Blake Sterling Hartwell, and I need Seat 1A for business reasons. The passenger currently assigned to that seat can be moved to economy class with appropriate compensation. This shouldn't be complicated." The casual dismissal of another passenger's rights, the assumption that someone could simply be moved to accommodate Blake's preferences, revealed everything Patricia needed to know about his character and the challenges ahead. She glanced toward the aircraft, knowing that in Seat 1A sat a quiet, well-dressed passenger who'd boarded early and was peacefully reading legal documents. The contrast between Blake's demanding presence and the other passenger's understated dignity was stark, setting up a confrontation that Patricia hoped she could avoid, but increasingly suspected was inevitable. Blake Sterling Hartwell strode down the jet bridge with the swagger of ownership, his Italian leather briefcase swinging at his side and his platinum Rolex catching the overhead lights as he moved. The narrow walkway felt smaller somehow when he was angry, his presence filling the space with an energy that made flight attendants step aside and passengers glance up from their phones. He'd been flying first class since he was 12 years old, accompanying his father on business trips that were more about networking than actual work, and in all those years he'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by mentioning his family name and letting natural hierarchy assert itself. Reaching Seat 1. Blake found exactly what he'd expected to find and exactly what he'd been told he'd find. But seeing it firsthand still triggered the familiar rush of indignation that came when the world didn't arrange itself according to his expectations. A black man in a hoodie, quietly reading what looked like legal documents, completely oblivious to the disruption he was causing simply by occupying space that Blake considered rightfully his. The scene confirmed every assumption Blake had made about what was wrong with airline procedures that didn't account for passenger importance and social hierarchy. "Excuse me," Blake said, his tone carrying the forced politeness that barely concealed his irritation. He stood in the aisle beside seat 1A, positioning himself so that his presence couldn't be ignored while maintaining the veneer of civilized interaction. "I think there's been a booking error. This is my seat." He gestured toward 1A with the confidence of someone stating an obvious fact rather than making a request expecting immediate acknowledgement and quick resolution. Damon looked up from his maritime law brief-taking in Blake's appearance and attitude with the trained observation of someone who'd spent years reading people in high-stakes negotiations. The expensive suit, the platinum hair, the particular combination of nervousness and entitlement that characterized people who'd never been challenged but weren't entirely confident in their authority. "I don't think so," Damon replied calmly, reaching into his jacket pocket to retrieve his boarding pass. "My boarding pass shows seat 1. A confirmed this morning when I checked in." The boarding pass was printed on the heavy cardstock that Skyline Airways used for first-class passengers, with Damon's name clearly visible alongside the seat assignment that Blake was claiming. More importantly, it showed the early check-in time that established Damon's legitimate priority over anyone who might have made last-minute requests or changes. Blake examined the boarding pass with the scrutiny of someone looking for technical errors that might invalidate what he was seeing, but the documentation was flawless. "Look, I'm sure you're a nice guy." Blake continued, his tone shifting to the patronizing friendliness that he'd learned to use when dealing with people he considered beneath his social level. "But there's obviously been some kind of system error. I fly this route every month, and I always sit in 1A. My assistant specifically requested it when she made the reservation. You probably got upgraded from economy or something, which is great, but I need this particular seat for business reasons." The assumption that Damon must have been upgraded from economy, that a black man in casual clothes couldn't have legitimately purchased a first-class ticket, revealed everything about Blake's worldview and the unconscious biases that shaped his interactions with people who didn't fit his expectations of what first-class passengers should look like. It was the kind of microaggression that Damon had encountered countless times throughout his career, subtle enough to provide plausible deniability, but clear enough to establish social hierarchy and undermine his right to occupy premium spaces. "I paid full fare for this seat," Damon said, his voice remaining level despite the obvious implications of Blake's assumption. "I'm traveling to London for legal proceedings that my firm has been preparing for 3 years. I checked in early specifically to ensure I'd have the workspace I needed for final case preparation. I'm afraid you'll need to speak with the flight attendants about alternative seating arrangements." Blake's face flushed with frustration as he realized that simple intimidation wasn't immediately resolving the situation. Throughout his life, problems like this had been solved by other people assistants and family lawyers and corporate executives who understood that Blake Sterling Hartwell's convenience was worth more than potential hurt feelings or minor inconveniences for strangers. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I specifically told my assistant to confirm 1A. Someone screwed up and I shouldn't have to pay for their mistake." Patricia Miller approached from the galley, having observed the developing tension from a distance and recognizing the need for professional intervention before the situation disrupted boarding for other passengers. Her 22 years of experience had taught her to read passenger dynamics quickly, to identify which conflicts could be resolved diplomatically, and which ones required firm boundaries to prevent escalation into larger problems. "Gentlemen," "Is there something I can help resolve?" she asked, positioning herself where she could address both passengers while maintaining the neutral professionalism that airline policy required. She could see Damon's boarding pass in his hand, could observe Blake's agitated body language, and could sense that this was developing into exactly the kind of confrontation that could delay departure and create negative experiences for everyone aboard the aircraft. Blake immediately redirected his attention to Patricia with the relief of someone who believed he was finally speaking to real authority. "Thank you. I'm Blake Sterling Hartwell, and there's been a booking error. This gentleman is in my seat 1A, and I need it for business reasons. I'm sure we can find him another seat somewhere else in the cabin, maybe with some compensation for the inconvenience." The casual assumption that Damon could simply be moved elsewhere, combined with the patronizing suggestion of compensation for accommodating Blake's demands, established the fundamental conflict that would drive everything that followed. Patricia found herself caught between passenger rights airline policy and the growing realization that this situation was more complex than typical seating disputes she'd handled in the past. Blake's patience, never particularly robust under normal circumstances, began deteriorating rapidly as he realized that his usual problem-solving methods weren't immediately effective in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. The expectations that had shaped his entire life, the understanding that problems got solved when he made his preferences known, were encountering unexpected resistance from people who seemed immune to his family's influence and social position. His voice took on the sharp edge that employees at Sterling Hartwell Development had learned to recognize as a warning sign of escalating demands and unreasonable expectations. "Look, let me make this simple for everyone," Blake announced, his tone shifting from frustrated politeness to the barely controlled aggression that he'd inherited from watching his father handle business negotiations. "I don't know how this gentleman got this seat, but I'm guessing it was some kind of affirmative action program or employee upgrade situation. That's fine, diversity is important, but I have actual business to conduct on this flight. I need the workspace, the privacy, and the specific amenities that Seat 1A provides." The phrase affirmative action hung in the air like poison gas, immediately transforming a simple seating dispute into something far more sinister and revealing Blake's true assumptions about why a black man might be occupying premium airline space. It was the kind of comment that couldn't be taken back, that revealed character in ways that no amount of expensive clothing or family connections could disguise. Damon felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with encountering overt racism in professional settings, the recognition that he was dealing with someone who saw his presence in first class as fundamentally illegitimate. Patricia Miller's experience with difficult passengers had never prepared her for handling blatant racial assumptions delivered with such casual confidence. Her training emphasized customer service and conflict resolution, but she found herself in territory that went far beyond typical passenger disputes into areas that touched on civil rights, corporate liability, and the kind of discrimination that could result in federal lawsuits against the airline. "Sir, all passengers who've purchased tickets have equal rights to their assigned seats," she said, her voice carrying less certainty than her words suggested. Dr. Sarah Chen, seated in 2C and preparing for her own London trip to present research at a medical conference, looked up from her laptop as the conversation took its ugly turn. As an Asian American surgeon who'd faced her own share of professional discrimination, she recognized immediately what was happening and instinctively reached for her phone. The interaction was occurring in a public space with implications that extended far beyond the immediate participants, and documenting it seemed like both a moral obligation and practical necessity. James Murphy, a freelance journalist in Seat 3A, traveling to London to cover financial corruption cases, had been only half listening to the developing conflict until Blake's comment about affirmative action made him fully alert. His professional instincts, honed by years of investigating stories about power privilege and abuse, told him that he was witnessing something significant unfold. He discreetly activated his phone's recording app, recognizing that this was either going to resolve quickly or escalate into something newsworthy. Blake, emboldened by what he interpreted as Patricia's willingness to consider his request, pressed his advantage with the confidence of someone who'd never faced serious consequences for inappropriate behavior. I'm not trying to be difficult here, but let's be practical about this. This gentleman probably paid significantly less for his ticket than I did assuming he paid anything at all. I'm a platinum member whose family has a corporate account worth hundreds of thousands annually. Basic customer service suggests that passenger priority should reflect passenger value to the airline. The mathematical calculation that Blake was proposing, the idea that passenger treatment should be directly proportional to financial contribution and social status, revealed a worldview that was both morally repugnant and potentially illegal under federal transportation discrimination laws. Damon recognized that he was no longer dealing with simple entitlement, but with someone whose assumptions about race, class, and social hierarchy were so deeply ingrained that he felt comfortable expressing them publicly in front of witnesses. Mr. Sterling Hartwell, Damon said, his voice maintaining the professional calm that he'd learned to deploy in courtrooms when opposing counsel made arguments that were both legally weak and ethically questionable. I think you should know that your comments about affirmative action and passenger value are being recorded by multiple people. You might want to reconsider your approach to this situation before it becomes something that affects your reputation and your family's business interests. The warning should have been a wake-up call for someone with basic social intelligence, an opportunity to step back from a confrontation that was clearly heading in dangerous directions. Instead, Blake interpreted it as a threat from someone he considered powerless, a confirmation that he was dealing with exactly the kind of person who would try to use political correctness and legal technicalities to claim rights they hadn't earned through legitimate achievement or social contribution. "Are you threatening me?" Blake asked, his voice rising loud enough to attract attention from passengers throughout the first-class cabin. "Because if you're trying to intimidate me with some kind of discrimination lawsuit, you picked the wrong guy. My father's lawyers eat people like you for breakfast, and I guarantee you don't have the resources to go up against Sterling Hartwell legal team in federal court." Captain Jennifer Walsh emerged from the cockpit, drawn by the escalating voices and her professional responsibility to address any situation that might compromise flight safety or passenger comfort. Her experience had taught her to recognize when passenger conflicts were moving beyond the flight attendant's ability to manage diplomatically, and the tension in the first-class cabin was becoming impossible to ignore. What she found was a scene that immediately triggered every alarm about potential discrimination incidents and the legal liability they created for airlines. The atmosphere in this first-class cabin had transformed from the usual pre-flight calm into something electric and dangerous, with passengers pretending to read magazines while straining to hear every word of a confrontation that everyone sensed was escalating beyond normal passenger disputes. Blake Sterling Hartwell's face had flushed to a deep red that contrasted sharply with his platinum hair, and his voice carried the particular edge that came when entitled people encountered resistance they couldn't immediately overcome through intimidation or family connections. Captain Walsh's appearance should have signaled to Blake that the situation had moved beyond simple customer service issues into territory that required adult supervision and diplomatic resolution. Instead, he interpreted her arrival as validation that his complaints were being taken seriously by airline authorities, confirmation that his demands would finally receive the attention they deserved from someone with real power to fix problems and accommodate platinum passenger preferences. "Captain, thank goodness," Blake said, immediately redirecting his attention to what he assumed would be a more sympathetic authority figure. "I need your help resolving a seating situation. This gentleman is in my seat 1A, and your flight attendant seems unable or unwilling to fix what's obviously a booking error. I have crucial business to conduct during this flight, and I specifically requested this seat when my reservation was made." Captain Walsh looked between Blake and Damon, taking in the expensive suit versus the casual hoodie, the agitated entitlement versus the calm professionalism, and immediately recognizing that she was dealing with something more complex than typical passenger preference conflicts. Her military background and aviation training had taught her to assess situations quickly and accurately, identifying real problems while filtering out noise and drama that didn't affect flight operations or passenger safety. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass?" she asked Blake, her tone carrying the neutral authority that airline captains used when they needed to establish facts rather than negotiate preferences. Blake produced his boarding pass with flourish, pointing to his name and the seat assignment that showed 2B rather than the 1A he'd been demanding. Captain Walsh examined it carefully, then looked at Damon's boarding pass, which clearly showed the earlier check-in time and legitimate assignment to the disputed seat. Blake's boarding pass told a story that contradicted everything he'd been claiming about confirmed reservations and booking errors. His assistant had indeed made a last-minute reservation request, but seat 1A had already been assigned to another passenger hours earlier. The documentation was clear, unambiguous, and completely undermined Blake's claims about having legitimate priority over the seat he was demanding. "Mr. Sterling Hartwell, your boarding pass shows seat 2B. Captain Walsh said, her tone remaining professional despite her growing understanding of what kind of passenger she was dealing with. "Mr. Washington's boarding pass shows seat 1A with an earlier check-in time. There doesn't appear to be any booking error here, just a situation where the seat you preferred wasn't available when your reservation was made." Blake's reaction to having his claims definitively contradicted by documentary evidence was immediate and explosive, revealing the full extent of his entitlement and the ugly assumptions that had been driving his behavior from the beginning. "This is unbelievable," he shouted, his voice carrying throughout the cabin and drawing alarmed looks from flight attendants and passengers alike. "I specifically told my assistant to get me 1A, and now you're telling me that some random guy in a hoodie gets priority over a platinum member whose family keeps this airline profitable." The reference to Damon as some random guy in a hoodie was calculated to emphasize the visual disparity between Blake's expensive presentation and Damon's deliberately understated appearance, playing on assumptions about class, race, and social hierarchy that Blake assumed would resonate with airline authorities. It was the kind of comment that revealed someone who'd never learned to see past surface appearances or question his own biases about who belonged in premium spaces. Damon's response was measured and strategic, the voice of someone who'd spent years dealing with opposition that underestimated his intelligence, education, and professional capabilities. "Captain Walsh, I think it's important that you understand this. Gentleman has spent the last 15 minutes suggesting that I don't belong in first class because of my race, that I must have received some kind of affirmative action upgrade, and that passenger treatment should be based on family wealth rather than legitimate ticket purchases." The summary was devastating in its clinical accuracy, laying out Blake's behavior in terms that immediately triggered Captain Walsh's understanding of federal discrimination laws and airline liability for hostile environments created by passenger conduct. Every major airline had extensive training about civil rights compliance, and Blake's comments placed Skyline Airways in potential legal jeopardy if they failed to address discriminatory behavior appropriately. Blake realized that his comments were being characterized as discrimination and immediately shifted to damage control. But his approach revealed someone who understood legal consequences without actually understanding why his behavior was problematic. "I never said anything about race." He protested, his voice taking on the defensive tone of someone who'd been caught saying something inappropriate but didn't understand why it was wrong. "I was talking about customer service priorities and passenger value. This is about business, not personal characteristics." Patricia Miller, who'd been hoping the captain's intervention would resolve the situation diplomatically, found herself facing a choice between accommodating a platinum passenger's demands and protecting the airline from discrimination liability. Her 22 years of experience told her that Blake's behavior was creating exactly the kind of hostile environment that resulted in federal investigations and corporate settlements. But her immediate concern was preventing further escalation that could delay departure and disrupt service for hundreds of other passengers. "Mr. Washington," she said, her voice carrying the apologetic tone of someone who was about to make a decision she knew was wrong but felt pressured into making anyway. "I'm wondering if you might be willing to accept a voluntary move to seat 4A which is also a window seat along with a $500 travel voucher for your inconvenience. It would help us resolve this situation quickly and get everyone to London on schedule. The offer was exactly what Blake had been demanding, validation that his aggressive tactics and family connections could override legitimate passenger rights when applied with sufficient persistence and social pressure. But it was also exactly the kind of institutional capitulation that Damon had spent his career fighting against, the moment when organizations chose convenience over justice and enabled discrimination by rewarding the people who practiced it most aggressively. Damon looked at Patricia Miller with the disappointment of someone who'd hoped for better, but wasn't surprised by what he was seeing. "Are you asking me to give up my legitimate seat assignment to accommodate someone who's been making racist assumptions about my right to be here?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what precedent was being set and what message was being sent about whose comfort mattered and whose dignity was expendable. The question hung in the air like an indictment, forcing everyone present to confront what was really happening and what side of it they wanted to be on. Blake sensed victory within reach and pressed his advantage with the cruel confidence of someone who'd learned that persistence and social pressure could overcome most obstacles when applied by people with sufficient privilege and family connections. "Look, buddy," Blake said, stepping closer to Damon's seat in a gesture that was clearly meant to be physically intimidating. "I don't know what your problem is, but you need to stop playing the race card and start being realistic about this situation. You're going to take the offer move to economy where you probably belong anyway and let the adults handle their business. Because if you don't, I'm going to make sure this becomes a very uncomfortable flight for everyone involved." The threat was explicit and physical, delivered close enough to Damon's face that several passengers could see the intimidation attempt. "Doctor." Chen's phone was recording. James Murphy was taking notes, and Captain Walsh was witnessing behavior that crossed every line of acceptable passenger conduct. But for Damon, the moment represented something larger than airline seating or customer service disputes. It was the moment when he had to choose between accepting discrimination for the sake of avoiding confrontation or using the power he'd spent decades accumulating to fight back against the kind of behavior that made spaces hostile for people who looked like him. Damon reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling to a contact that he'd never expected to use from an airplane seat, but that represented exactly the kind of strategic leverage he'd been building throughout his career. The call wasn't to a lawyer or a civil rights organization. It was to someone with the power to ground every plane in Skyline Airways' fleet with a single conversation about legal compliance and operational authorization. "I'm not moving," Damon said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who'd finally decided to use the full extent of his power. "But I am making a phone call." Damon Washington's thumb moved across his phone screen with the deliberate precision of someone who'd spent years understanding the importance of strategic timing and calculated responses to aggression. The contact he selected wasn't listed under a name that would be immediately recognizable to airline passengers or crew members, but the number connected directly to Linda Morrison, Director of Flight Operations for Skyline Airways' entire domestic fleet. A woman whose authority extended from individual aircraft to comprehensive fleet management decisions that could affect thousands of passengers and millions of dollars in operational costs. Blake Sterling Hartwell watched Damon's phone manipulation with the dismissive confidence of someone who assumed he was witnessing an empty gesture designed to create artificial leverage in a situation where real power had already been clearly established. "Oh, what are you going to do?" Blake sneered, his voice carrying the mocking tone that he'd perfected during years of watching his father intimidate business opponents and service workers who stepped out of their assigned roles. "Call your lawyer. Call the ACP. Call Jesse Jackson. None of that matters when you're dealing with people who have real influence and actual power in industries that matter. The mockery was calculated to demonstrate Blake's certainty that whatever resources Damon might have access to were insignificant compared to the Sterling Hartwell family's political connections, financial influence, and social network that extended from Chicago politics to federal regulatory agencies. It was the confident dismissal of someone who'd never encountered resistance that couldn't be overcome through family connections or financial pressure applied at the appropriate levels of corporate and governmental hierarchy. Patricia Miller watched the phone call preparation with growing anxiety, recognizing that passenger conflicts that involved recording devices and external communications typically escalated far beyond the scope of problems that could be resolved through in-flight customer service protocols. Her training had covered discrimination complaints and federal civil rights requirements, but the practical reality of implementing those policies when faced with platinum passengers making explicit threats was far more complex than corporate training scenarios suggested. Captain Walsh positioned herself where she could observe both passengers, while maintaining the neutral authority that airline captains needed when dealing with conflicts that might require federal reporting or legal documentation. Her military background had taught her to recognize when situations were moving beyond diplomatic resolution toward confrontations that would require official intervention and careful record-keeping for potential legal proceedings. The phone call connected after 2 rings, answered by Linda Morrison's direct line with the professional efficiency that characterized senior airline operations personnel who dealt with crisis management on a daily basis. Linda Morrison, Flight Operations Director, came the crisp voice through Damon's phone, immediately establishing the authority level he'd reached with his strategic contact selection. Linda, this is Damon Washington from Washington and Associates Legal. Damon said, his voice shifting into the authoritative tone that he used in courtrooms and boardrooms when representing clients whose interests required immediate attention and decisive action. I'm currently aboard Skyline Airways Flight 447 to London, and I need to report a federal civil rights violation that's occurring in real time with crew complicity and management awareness. Blake's smug confidence faltered slightly as he heard the professional language and authoritative tone that suggested Damon's phone call might be more serious than the empty gesture he'd anticipated. The mention of federal civil rights violations and crew complicity carried legal implications that extended far beyond customer service complaints or passenger preference disputes, touching on areas of liability that could result in government investigations and corporate sanctions. Linda Morrison's voice sharpened with immediate concern as she heard key phrases that triggered airline industry crisis management protocols. Mr. Washington, can you provide specific details about the violation you're reporting? Are you in immediate physical danger, and do we need to implement emergency response procedures? Her questions reflected standard operating procedures for handling discrimination complaints that could result in Federal Transportation Department investigations and significant financial penalties for airlines found in violation of civil rights requirements. I'm being subjected to racial discrimination by a passenger named Blake Sterling Hartwell, who's demanding that I be removed from my legitimately assigned first-class seat, based on his assumption that black passengers don't belong in premium cabin space. Damon explained, his voice carrying the clinical precision of someone documenting evidence for legal proceedings. The lead flight attendant has offered to move me to accommodate his racist demands, and the captain has witnessed the discriminatory behavior without taking appropriate intervention action. The summary was devastating in its accuracy and legal implications, immediately establishing grounds for federal civil rights violations, while implicating both crew members and corporate policies in enabling discriminatory passenger behavior. Linda Morrison's experience with airline crisis management told her that she was receiving the kind of complaint that could result in Transportation Department investigations, media attention, and significant financial liability for Skyline Airways, if not handled with immediate and decisive action. Blake realized that his dismissive assumptions about Damon's resources and connections were being contradicted by the apparent seriousness with which the flight operations director was treating the complaint. "Who is this guy?" he asked Captain Walsh, his voice carrying the first hints of uncertainty that he'd displayed since boarding the aircraft. The confidence that had driven his aggressive behavior was being undermined by the recognition that Damon might have access to authority levels that Blake hadn't anticipated or prepared for. "Linda, I need you to understand that this isn't just a customer service issue." Damon continued, his voice taking on the strategic authority that came from years of handling corporate liability cases and understanding how legal pressure could be applied effectively to large organizations. "This is a federal civil rights violation occurring aboard an aircraft operated under Skyline Airways' legal authority, with crew members who are creating hostile environments for passengers based on racial characteristics. The incident is being recorded by multiple witnesses, and I'm documenting everything for potential federal investigation." The mention of federal investigation and recorded evidence immediately escalated the situation beyond anything that could be handled through standard customer service protocols or passenger accommodation procedures. Linda Morrison understood that she was receiving the kind of complaint that required immediate legal consultation and crisis management responses designed to protect the airline from significant regulatory and financial consequences. "Mr. Washington, I'm implementing emergency discrimination response protocols immediately," Linda Morrison announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose decisions could affect entire flight operations and corporate liability exposure. "I'm instructing Captain Walsh to suspend flight operations pending resolution of the civil rights complaint, and I'm dispatching legal and customer relations personnel to handle this situation with the sensitivity and urgency it requires." Blake's face went white as he heard the flight operations director announce flight suspension, finally understanding that his aggressive behavior had triggered consequences far beyond anything he'd anticipated when he'd decided to intimidate someone he'd assumed was powerless. The recognition that his demands for premium seating had escalated into federal civil rights violations with potential legal and financial ramifications was beginning to penetrate his privileged assumptions about consequence-free behavior. The electronic chime that sounded throughout the aircraft cabin wasn't the familiar boarding announcement or safety demonstration alert that passengers had grown accustomed to during routine flight preparations. Instead, it was the sharp, urgent triple tone that flight crews recognized as an emergency communication requiring immediate attention from all personnel. The kind of sound that meant normal operations were being suspended in favor of crisis management protocols that most passengers never experienced during typical commercial aviation travel. Captain Walsh's radio crackled to life with a priority message from ground control that carried the formal language of operational suspension and legal compliance requirements. "Skyline 447, this is ground control. You are directed to maintain gate position and suspend all departure preparations pending resolution of a federal civil rights investigation. Legal personnel and senior management are being dispatched to your location for immediate consultation and passenger interview protocols." Blake Sterling Hartwell's confident smirk disappeared completely as he heard official references to federal investigations and legal personnel finally understanding that his aggressive demands for seat changes had somehow escalated far beyond customer service disputes into territory that involved government agencies and corporate legal teams. The privileged assumptions that had shaped his entire approach to the situation were crumbling as he realized that his family name and social connections might not protect him from consequences he'd never bothered to consider. "What's happening?" Blake asked Captain Walsh, his voice taking on the uncertain tone of someone who was beginning to suspect that he'd misunderstood fundamental aspects of the situation he'd created. "Why are they talking about investigations? This is just a seating dispute. I never did anything illegal. I just wanted to sit in a seat that should have been mine in the first place." Patricia Miller's 22 years of airline experience had never prepared her for witnessing passenger behavior that resulted in flight suspensions and federal investigation protocols. But her understanding of corporate liability and civil rights requirements told her that Blake's recorded comments about affirmative action and passenger value had created exactly the kind of hostile environment that airlines were legally required to address through immediate and decisive action. Dr. Sarah Chen continued recording the developing situation while simultaneously taking notes on her laptop, recognizing that she was documenting what appeared to be a significant civil rights incident with potential legal and social implications that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Her medical training had taught her to observe and document unusual situations carefully, and her personal experience with discrimination had given her insight into the importance of creating accurate records when witnessing bias-motivated behavior. James Murphy's journalistic instincts were fully activated as he realized that he was witnessing a story that combined elements of racial discrimination, corporate accountability, and social privilege in ways that would resonate with audiences interested in justice and consequence for entitled behavior. His notes were capturing not just the dialogue and actions, but the broader context of power dynamics and assumption that were being challenged in real time aboard a commercial aircraft. Damon remained seated in 1A, maintaining the calm professionalism that had served him well throughout years of high-stakes legal negotiations and courtroom confrontations with opponents who'd underestimated his capabilities and resources. His phone call with Linda Morrison had accomplished exactly what he'd intended, triggering corporate crisis management protocols that would ensure this incident received appropriate attention and documentation, rather than being dismissed as a minor customer service issue. Blake, I think you should know something important about the situation you've created. Damon said, his voice carrying the educational tone that he used when explaining complex legal concepts to clients who needed to understand the full implications of their circumstances. My law firm, Washington & Associates, holds the compliance review contracts for Skyline Airways' entire domestic fleet. We're responsible for ensuring that the airline meets federal civil rights requirements and maintains operational authorization for passenger service. The revelation hit Blake like a physical blow, finally explaining why a phone call from a passenger in casual clothes had resulted in immediate flight suspension and emergency legal protocols. The quiet man he'd been trying to intimidate wasn't just another passenger with limited resources and no institutional power. He was someone whose professional authority extended directly into the airline's operational compliance and legal authorization to conduct business. You... What? Blake stammered, his voice cracking with the recognition that he'd spent the last hour aggressively confronting someone who held significant legal authority over the very airline whose services he'd been demanding. You're saying you work for the airline? Then why didn't you just say that from the beginning? We could have worked something out without all this drama and federal investigation nonsense. The suggestion that disclosure of his professional relationship with Skyline Airways would have prevented Blake's discriminatory behavior revealed someone who fundamentally misunderstood why civil rights laws existed and why equal treatment couldn't be conditional on passenger status or professional connections. Damon's response was measured and instructive, designed to help Blake understand concepts about dignity and equal treatment that his privileged background had apparently never required him to consider. Blake, the point isn't that I work with this airline. Damon explained, his voice carrying the patient authority of someone who'd spent years educating people about civil rights principles and legal requirements for equal treatment. The point is that every passenger, regardless of their race, professional status, or family connections, has the right to occupy seats they've legitimately purchased without being subjected to discriminatory harassment or assumptions about whether they belong in premium cabin space. Captain Walsh received another priority communication from ground control, this time informing her that senior Skyline Airways executives were being briefed about the situation, and that Federal Transportation Department personnel had been notified about potential civil rights violations occurring aboard aircraft operating under the airline's authority. The escalation was following established protocols for handling discrimination complaints that could result in government sanctions and significant financial penalties. Blake's phone rang with an incoming call from his father, Richard Sterling Hartwell, whose business connections had already alerted him to developing problems involving his son and potential legal complications with business partners and corporate accounts. Blake answered with trembling hands, immediately launching into explanations that revealed his continued failure to understand the seriousness of his situation or the extent of the consequences he'd triggered through his aggressive behavior. Richard Sterling Hartwell's voice carried across the aircraft cabin with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to solving problems through financial leverage and political connections. But the tone was strained with an underlying panic that suggested he understood his son had created a crisis beyond the scope of typical Sterling Hartwell damage control capabilities. His 40 years of Chicago real estate development had taught him to recognize when family behavior threatened business relationships that took decades to build and could be destroyed in minutes through inappropriate conduct. Blake, what exactly did you say to this passenger? Richard demanded, his voice carrying through the phone with enough volume that nearby passengers could hear the conversation. I'm getting calls from 3 board members and the mayor's office about discrimination complaints and federal investigations involving our family name. The airline's CEO is refusing to take my calls, and our corporate counsel is telling me to prepare for potential civil rights lawsuits. Blake's face had gone pale as he realized that his airport tantrum was generating consequences that extended far beyond his personal travel convenience into territory that could affect his family's business empire and political relationships throughout Chicago. Dad, it's not what you think, he began, his voice taking on the defensive tone of someone who'd spent his life having problems solved by other people but was beginning to understand that this situation might be beyond his father's ability to fix through traditional influence and financial pressure. I was just trying to get my usual seat from someone who didn't look like a typical first-class passenger, Blake continued, apparently unaware that his explanation was making the discrimination complaint worse rather than better. How was I supposed to know he was some kind of lawyer who works with the airline? If he'd just identified himself from the beginning, we could have avoided all this federal investigation nonsense. The admission that Blake's behavior was based on assumptions about what typical first-class passengers should look like was being recorded by Dr. Chen and overheard by James Murphy, creating additional documentation of discriminatory intent that would strengthen any potential civil rights case against both Blake personally and Skyline Airways for enabling his behavior through crew accommodation of his demands. Richard Sterling Hartwell's background in Chicago politics and real estate development had given him enough experience with discrimination lawsuits to recognize that his son's recorded comments about passenger appearance and typical first-class demographics were exactly the kind of evidence that civil rights attorneys used to prove intentional bias in federal court proceedings. Blake stopped talking immediately. Richard commanded, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood that every word his son spoke was potentially creating additional legal liability. Damon's phone rang with another call from Linda Morrison, who was now coordinating with senior Skyline Airways executives and legal counsel to address the civil rights complaint while minimizing corporate liability and regulatory consequences. Mr. Washington, I have CEO Marcus Thornton and General Counsel Patricia Reynolds on the line. They'd like to speak with you directly about resolution of this incident and appropriate consequences for discriminatory passenger behavior. The escalation to CEO-level involvement demonstrated the seriousness with which Skyline Airways was treating the civil rights complaint, recognizing that Federal Transportation Department investigations could result in significant financial penalties and operational restrictions that would affect the airline's ability to conduct business. Blake's recorded comments about affirmative action and passenger value had created exactly the kind of liability that required immediate senior management attention and strategic legal response. Captain Walsh received updated instructions from ground control, directing her to prepare detailed incident reports for federal authorities while maintaining aircraft security and passenger safety during the extended ground delay. Her military background and aviation training had prepared her for handling various emergency situations. But civil rights violations with potential federal investigation requirements were creating documentation and procedural challenges that went far beyond typical flight operations. Blake attempted to contact his family's legal counsel, but discovered that Sterling Hartwell corporate attorneys were refusing to represent him personally in civil rights matters that could create conflicts of interest with the family's business operations and political relationships. The recognition that he might need independent legal representation was beginning to penetrate his privileged assumptions about consequence-free behavior and family protection from legal accountability. Dr. Chen shared her recorded video with James Murphy, creating multiple documentation sources that captured Blake's discriminatory comments and aggressive behavior in detail that would be difficult to dispute or minimize through legal maneuvering. Their collaboration was generating the kind of comprehensive evidence that civil rights cases required to demonstrate intentional discrimination rather than misunderstandings or communication failures. Patricia Miller found herself facing potential disciplinary action for offering to move Damon in response to Blake's discriminatory demands, her attempt to resolve the situation diplomatically having been interpreted as crew complicity in creating hostile environments for passengers based on racial characteristics. Her 22 years of service were being overshadowed by a single incident that revealed gaps in her understanding of civil rights requirements and appropriate responses to passenger discrimination. The aircraft cabin had become a legal and media documentation zone where every conversation was being recorded and analyzed for evidence of discriminatory intent, corporate liability, and federal civil rights violations that could result in significant financial and regulatory consequences for all parties involved. Blake's confident assumption that his family name and social position would protect him from accountability was being systematically demolished through professional legal and corporate responses that he'd never anticipated or prepared for. Damon's strategic decision to document and escalate the discrimination complaint rather than accepting crew offers to accommodate Blake's demands was generating exactly the kind of institutional accountability that his legal career had been designed to achieve, using established civil rights protections and corporate liability requirements to ensure that discriminatory behavior faced appropriate consequences rather than being enabled through passenger accommodation policies. The arrival of Port Authority police officers at Gate B-12 marked the transition from airline customer service dispute to federal civil rights investigation, with Blake Sterling Hartwell's discriminatory behavior having triggered law enforcement protocols that extended far beyond typical passenger conflicts into territory involving Federal Transportation Department regulations and criminal civil rights violations. Officer Michael Rodriguez and Sergeant Karen Thompson approached the aircraft with the measured professionalism of law enforcement personnel who'd been briefed about potential federal crimes requiring careful evidence collection and witness interview procedures. Blake's attempts to contact his family's legal representation had been unsuccessful, with Sterling Hartwell corporate attorneys declining to provide personal representation for discrimination matters that could create legal conflicts with the family's extensive business relationships throughout Chicago's political and financial establishment. The recognition that he might face federal charges without the family legal protection he'd always taken for granted was beginning to penetrate his privileged assumptions about consequence-free behavior. Richard Sterling Hartwell's emergency consultation with his personal attorney David Kellerman had resulted in brutal assessments about potential legal and financial exposure for both Blake personally and the Sterling Hartwell business empire through association with documented discriminatory behavior. Richard: Your son's recorded comments about affirmative action and passenger value create textbook evidence of intentional racial discrimination, Kellerman explained during a conference call that included 3 other attorneys and the family's crisis management consultant. The video evidence shows him making explicitly racist assumptions about who belongs in first-class seating, and the airline's initial accommodation of his demands creates corporate liability that could result in federal sanctions and significant financial penalties. Kellerman continued, his voice carrying the grim authority of someone who'd spent decades handling high-stakes legal crises for wealthy families whose children had created public relations disasters through inappropriate behavior. Skyline Airways' stock price had already begun declining as news of the discrimination incident spread through social media and financial news networks, with investors recognizing that federal civil rights investigations could result in operational restrictions and financial penalties that would affect the airline's profitability and competitive position in the commercial aviation market. CEO Marcus Thornton was coordinating with the board of directors to implement crisis management protocols designed to minimize regulatory and financial consequences while demonstrating corporate commitment to civil rights compliance. Dr. Sarah Chen and James Murphy had shared their recorded evidence with civil rights organizations and media outlets, creating multiple documentation sources that would make it impossible for Blake or Skyline Airways to minimize or mischaracterize the discriminatory behavior that had occurred aboard the aircraft. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the American Civil Liberties Union had both expressed interest in the case as an example of ongoing discrimination in commercial aviation that required federal enforcement and corporate accountability. Patricia Miller received formal notification of suspension pending investigation, with her 22 years of service being overshadowed by her offer to accommodate Blake's discriminatory demands, rather than enforcing equal treatment policies that airlines were legally required to maintain for all passengers, regardless of race or social status. Her decision to prioritize customer service over civil rights compliance had created personal liability and career consequences that would affect her family's financial security and her professional reputation in the aviation industry. Blake's arrest for disorderly conduct and assault occurred when he physically attempted to prevent Damon from deplaning, grabbing his shoulder in a gesture that multiple witnesses recorded as criminal battery with clear discriminatory motivation. The charges were federal rather than local due to the aviation setting and civil rights context, creating potential penalties that included significant prison time and financial consequences that his family's wealth couldn't eliminate through political influence or legal maneuvering. Social media coverage of the incident had exploded beyond typical viral content into sustained national attention focused on discrimination in commercial aviation and the accountability of wealthy individuals whose privileged assumptions created hostile environments for passengers of color. The hashtag Seat1A was trending globally, with millions of people sharing their own experiences of discrimination in premium travel spaces and demanding corporate accountability for enabling racist passenger behavior. Sterling Hartwell Development's municipal contracts were being reviewed by Chicago city administrators who recognized that association with documented discrimination could create political liability for elected officials who continued business relationships with the family's real estate empire. Mayor Patricia Williams announced that all Sterling Hartwell projects would be subjected to enhanced civil rights compliance reviews, effectively freezing millions of dollars in development projects until the family could demonstrate commitment to equal treatment principles. The Federal Transportation Department's Office of Civil Rights had opened a formal investigation into Skyline Airways' policies and training procedures for handling passenger discrimination, with potential penalties, including operational restrictions and financial sanctions that could affect the airline's ability to compete effectively in commercial aviation markets. The investigation would examine whether Blake's incident represented isolated poor judgment or evidence of institutional patterns that enabled discriminatory treatment of passengers based on racial characteristics. 6 weeks after the incident aboard Skyline Airways Flight 447, the federal civil rights investigation had expanded far beyond Blake Sterling Hartwell's individual behavior into comprehensive examination of airline industry practices that enabled discrimination through insufficient training, inadequate policies, and corporate cultures that prioritized customer satisfaction over equal treatment requirements mandated by federal law. The Department of Transportation's findings would reshape commercial aviation policies nationwide, while establishing legal precedents for holding both individuals and corporations accountable for creating hostile environments based on racial characteristics. Blake's federal trial for civil rights violations had become a focal point for national conversations about privilege accountability and the legal consequences of discriminatory behavior in commercial settings. His recorded comments about affirmative action and passenger value provided prosecutors with exactly the kind of clear evidence needed to prove intentional discrimination under federal hate crime statutes that carried significant prison sentences and financial penalties designed to deter similar behavior by other wealthy individuals who assumed their social status provided immunity from legal consequences. U.S. District Judge Maria Santos, presiding over Blake's trial, had established strict courtroom protocols that prevented his family's legal team from introducing character witnesses or community service evidence that might minimize the seriousness of his discriminatory behavior. This court is concerned with the defendant's actions and their impact on civil rights, not his family's charitable contributions or social standing, Judge Santos announced during pre-trial hearings that attracted national media attention and civil rights organization monitoring. Blake's conviction on federal civil rights violations resulted in an 18-month prison sentence, 3 years of supervised probation, and mandatory participation in diversity education programs designed to address the racist assumptions that had driven his behavior aboard the aircraft. The financial penalties included restitution payments to Damon, Washington, and donations to civil rights organizations totaling $250,000 amounts that represented genuine consequences for someone whose trust fund had previously protected him from any meaningful accountability for inappropriate behavior. Richard Sterling Hartwell's efforts to minimize business consequences for the Sterling Hartwell development empire had been largely unsuccessful, with Chicago municipal authorities implementing enhanced civil rights compliance requirements for all city contracts that would cost the family millions of dollars in additional oversight and documentation requirements. The mayor's office had made clear that future business relationships depended on demonstrable commitment to equal treatment principles rather than mere legal compliance with minimum federal requirements. Skyline Airways' settlement with Damon, Washington included financial compensation exceeding $2 million, along with comprehensive policy reforms designed to prevent similar incidents through enhanced crew training, clear discrimination, reporting procedures, and executive accountability measures that would ensure senior management attention to civil rights compliance rather than treating such issues as minor customer service matters to be handled by flight attendants with insufficient authority or training. The airline's new Washington protocols established mandatory federal civil rights training for all crew members, clear escalation procedures for handling passenger discrimination, and senior management accountability for creating inclusive environments that protected all passengers from hostile treatment based on racial characteristics or other protected status. Patricia Miller's participation in the new training program as part of her reinstatement demonstrated the airline's commitment to education and second chances for employees who made mistakes but showed genuine willingness to learn and improve. Federal aviation authorities used the Skyline Airways case as a model for industry-wide policy reforms that established clear expectations for civil rights compliance across all commercial airlines, with significant financial penalties and operational restrictions for carriers that failed to maintain adequate training policies and accountability measures. The new federal requirements created standardized responses to passenger discrimination that prioritized equal treatment over customer satisfaction when the two principles came into conflict. Dr. Sarah Chen's medical conference presentation about witnessing and documenting discrimination had inspired healthcare professionals to develop similar protocols for addressing bias in medical settings, while James Murphy's investigative reporting on the case had earned him a Pulitzer Prize nomination for coverage that connected individual discrimination incidents to broader patterns of institutional inequality that required federal enforcement and corporate accountability to address effectively. Blake's father, Richard, had been forced to remove his son from all positions within Sterling Hartwell Development and establish a family trust structure that prevented Blake from accessing significant inherited wealth until he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation through community service and civil rights education programs. The family's reputation in Chicago business and political circles would require years of rebuilding through demonstrated commitment to equal treatment principles rather than mere legal compliance with federal requirements. The broader impact of Damon's decision to escalate rather than accommodate Blake's discriminatory demands had created ripple effects throughout the commercial aviation industry, with multiple airlines reviewing and strengthening their civil rights policies to avoid similar federal investigations and the significant financial and reputational consequences that resulted from enabling passenger discrimination through inadequate training and accountability measures. The early morning light filtering through the windows of Damon Washington's Chicago penthouse carried a different quality. 6 months after the incident that had transformed his understanding of how strategic legal action could create institutional change far beyond individual case resolutions. His maritime law victory in London had been successful, saving his client's family shipping business and the 47 jobs that depended on it. But the civil rights case against Blake Sterling Hartwell and Skyline Airways had generated consequences that continued rippling through commercial aviation, legal precedent, and national conversations about accountability for discriminatory behavior. Damon's expanded civil rights practice had attracted clients from across the country who'd experienced similar discrimination in commercial settings, but had previously lacked access to legal representation with the resources and expertise needed to hold major corporations accountable for enabling hostile environments based on racial characteristics. His success in the Skyline Airways case had established him as a leading attorney for passengers seeking justice for airline discrimination, while demonstrating that individual courage combined with strategic legal action could create lasting institutional change. The Washington Institute for Commercial Civil Rights, established with proceeds from the Skyline Airways settlement, was providing legal education and advocacy resources for travelers who encountered discrimination but lacked the professional background or financial resources to pursue federal civil rights claims independently. The Institute's work had already resulted in policy changes at 7 major airlines and training programs that were being adopted throughout the commercial aviation industry as best practices for protecting passenger rights. Blake Sterling Hartwell's transformation during his federal prison sentence had been genuine and profound, shaped by mandatory participation in diversity education programs and direct contact with people whose experiences of discrimination contrasted sharply with his previous privileged assumptions about race, class, and social hierarchy. His letters of apology to Damon, Dr. Chen James Murphy, and Patricia Miller had demonstrated understanding of how his behavior had affected multiple people and his commitment to using his remaining family resources to support civil rights education rather than personal luxury. Blake's post-release employment with a Chicago nonprofit organization focused on criminal justice reform represented a complete reversal of his previous lifestyle and values, with his work advocating for people whose legal problems stemmed from poverty and systemic inequality rather than privilege and entitlement. His father, Richard, had expressed pride in his son's transformation while acknowledging that accountability and consequences had achieved positive changes that years of wealth and protection had failed to produce. Patricia Miller's successful completion of enhanced civil rights training had led to her promotion to senior flight attendant trainer, responsible for implementing the Washington protocols throughout Skyline Airways crew training programs and ensuring that all airline personnel understood their legal obligations to protect passengers from discriminatory treatment. Her experience during the Blake Sterling Hartwell incident had become a teaching tool for helping other crew members recognize and respond appropriately to passenger discrimination. Skyline Airways' comprehensive policy reforms had resulted in the airline becoming an industry leader in civil rights compliance, with customer satisfaction scores increasing rather than decreasing as passengers of all backgrounds experienced more respectful and equitable treatment throughout their travel experiences. The airline's stock price had recovered and exceeded pre-incident levels as investors recognized that strong civil rights compliance reduced legal liability while improving customer loyalty and brand reputation. Dr. Sarah Chen's research on bystander intervention during discrimination incidents had been published in multiple medical and social science journals, providing evidence-based strategies for witnesses who wanted to document and address bias-motivated behavior but weren't sure how to intervene effectively without creating additional conflict or safety risks. Her work had influenced training programs for healthcare workers, educators, and other professionals who encountered discrimination in their workplaces. James Murphy's continued investigative reporting on discrimination in commercial aviation had uncovered similar patterns at other airlines, resulting in additional federal investigations and policy reforms that extended the impact of the Skyline Airways case throughout the industry. His documentation of how individual acts of courage could create institutional accountability had inspired other journalists to focus on civil rights enforcement and corporate responsibility for protecting customers and employees from discriminatory treatment. The broader cultural impact of the hashtag #SeatOne. A movement had extended far beyond commercial aviation into conversations about privilege, accountability, and the importance of bystander intervention when witnessing discriminatory behavior in public spaces. The case had become required reading in law schools, business programs, and diversity training courses as an example of how strategic legal action could achieve both individual justice and institutional change simultaneously. 1 year after the incident, Damon, Washington walked through the same jet bridge at O'Hare Terminal 3, boarding the same London route that had become the setting for a confrontation that had changed multiple lives and created lasting improvements in commercial aviation civil rights protections. The crew's professional greeting reflected the new training protocols that emphasized respect and dignity for all passengers, regardless of their appearance or assumptions about their status or background. Seated once again in 1A, Damon reflected on how a single decision to resist accommodation of discriminatory demands had generated consequences far beyond anything he could have anticipated when he'd reached for his phone to call Linda Morrison. The maritime law brief that had been interrupted by Blake's aggressive behavior was now replaced by correspondence from civil rights organizations, thank you letters from passengers who'd experienced better treatment because of policy changes, and speaking requests from law schools wanting him to address the relationship between individual courage and institutional accountability. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and taxied toward takeoff, Damon thought about his mother's words about dignity being a weapon and excellence being armor understanding. Now how the combination had enabled him to transform a moment of discrimination into lasting change that would protect future travelers from experiencing the hostility and assumptions that had characterized his encounter with Blake Sterling Hartwell. The quiet victory wasn't just personal vindication, but evidence that strategic resistance to discrimination could create ripple effects that strengthened civil rights protections for everyone who followed. The engines spooled up for takeoff, lifting the aircraft above Chicago's skyline toward London and the continuing work of international law. But Damon's thoughts remained focused on the understanding that justice required more than individual success. It required the courage to resist accommodation of discrimination, even when resistance created conflict. The persistence to pursue accountability, even when institutions preferred quiet resolution, and the vision to recognize that individual acts of courage could create collective transformation when supported by strategic legal action and community solidarity. The story of #SeatOne. A reminds us that dignity isn't negotiable and justice isn't accidental. Sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is simply refusing to accept it as normal, refusing to accommodate it for the sake of avoiding conflict, and insisting that institutions live up to their stated values rather than their convenient practices. Change happens when ordinary people find the courage to resist extraordinary injustice, one seat, one phone call, one moment of strategic courage at a time. If this story inspired you or made you think differently about bystander intervention and individual accountability for creating inclusive spaces, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments about times when you've witnessed discrimination and how you chose to respond. Together we can build a culture where dignity and respect are universal, rather than privileges that depend on appearance status or family connections.